On a bright morning with the airport bustling like a beehive, anticipation filled the air as passengers hurried to their gates. Among the crowd was a young black man named Darnell. With a warm smile and a confident stride, he approached the gate for his flight. Darnell was excited about this journey, a chance to visit family he hadn't seen in years. Despite the chaos of the airport, his upbeat energy was contagious, drawing friendly smiles from some travelers passing by. Boarding time came, and Darnell stepped onto the plane, greeted by the soothing hum of the engines. Finding his assigned seat, he tucked his bag into the overhead compartment and settled by the window. He glanced around, observing the mix of passengers stowing their belongings and chatting softly. Across the aisle, an elderly couple exchanged travel stories, while a group of teens whispered excitedly about their destination. Then came Meredith. Meredith was a sharply dressed woman in her late 50s with a demeanor that suggested she was used to getting her way. Her jewelry clinked softly as she walked down the aisle, a designer handbag hanging from her arm. Her expression was tight, her lips pursed, as if the mere act of flying among strangers was beneath her. She paused in front of the row where Darnell sat, scanning the seat numbers. "Excuse me," she said, addressing the flight attendant nearby. Her tone was low but tinged with irritation. "There must be some mistake. I'm supposed to be seated here." The flight attendant, a young woman with a calm professionalism, checked Meredith's ticket and confirmed her seat right next to Darnell. "Yes, ma'am, this is your assigned seat." Meredith's eyes flicked to Darnell, and something shifted in her expression. It was subtle but unmistakable, a tightening of her jaw, a fleeting look of disapproval. She hesitated before speaking again. "I'd like to request a seat change," she said firmly. "Unfortunately, the flight is full," the attendant replied politely. "All seats are occupied, but I assure you, this row is perfectly fine." Meredith's gaze lingered on Darnell for a moment longer than necessary, and the tension in the air became palpable. Darnell, sensing the weight of her scrutiny, shifted slightly but said nothing. He wasn't new to these situations and had learned that silence often spoke louder than words. Meredith, however, wasn't ready to let it go. "I'm sorry," she said, raising her voice slightly. "But I don't feel comfortable sitting here. Is there really no other option?" Passengers nearby began to glance over, curious about the commotion. Darnell maintained his composure, staring out the window as if he hadn't noticed the escalating scene. The flight attendant, now visibly uncomfortable, explained again that all seats were assigned, and there was no possibility of moving. "You expect me to sit here for the entire flight?" Meredith snapped, her tone dripping with indignation. "This is unacceptable." Her words hung in the air like an awkward pause in a conversation. Passengers exchanged uneasy looks, some whispering to one another. The elderly woman across the aisle gave Meredith a disapproving frown but said nothing. The tension thickened, and for a moment, it felt like time had slowed. Finally, the flight attendant's voice broke the silence. "Ma'am, I assure you that all passengers are treated equally on this flight. Please take your seat so we can depart on time." Meredith let out an exaggerated sigh but reluctantly sat down, her movements stiff with annoyance. She angled herself away from Darnell as if physical proximity might offend her. Darnell remained calm, his hands resting on his lap, his gaze still fixed on the world outside the plane. He had long mastered the art of rising above these moments, but that didn't make them any easier to endure. As the plane taxied onto the runway, the atmosphere in the row was tense, the unspoken conflict simmering beneath the surface. But what Meredith didn't know was that life has a way of delivering unexpected lessons, and hers was about to arrive mid-flight, in a way no one on that plane could have anticipated. As the plane ascended, the smooth hum of the engines filled the cabin, but it did little to ease the tension between Meredith and Darnell. The flight attendants moved up and down the aisle, offering drinks and snacks, but the awkwardness remained, unspoken yet undeniable. Meredith's eyes occasionally flicked toward Darnell, though she did her best to avoid looking directly at him. The briefest glance would confirm what she had already decided: the discomfort wasn't just about the seat. There was something else. Darnell, however, remained calm. It wasn't the first time he had found himself in a situation like this, nor would it be the last. He had grown used to people's judgment, their assumptions, the unspoken barriers they put up. Simply because of the color of his skin. He had learned to live with it, to rise above the subtle and sometimes overt disdain that often found its way into everyday interactions. But that didn't mean it didn't sting, especially in moments like this when the discrimination was so palpable, it was almost suffocating. Meredith, on the other hand, had lived a life where she rarely faced any challenge to her beliefs or prejudices. Raised in a small, insular community, she had always been surrounded by people who looked like her, who shared her opinions, and who reinforced her worldview. She had never had to confront the reality of racism in her own actions. And it wasn't until now sitting next to a black man on a plane that she even acknowledged the discomfort she felt. It wasn't just about Darnell being there. It was about everything he represented, the changing world, the shift in societal norms, and a discomfort she wasn't used to confronting. Her mind raced as she thought about the flight ahead. Meredith had always prided herself on control over her surroundings, her life, and her interactions with others. But in this moment, she felt helpless, trapped in a seat she didn't want, next to a person she didn't want to sit next to. The more she thought about it, the more irritated she became. She couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, this was an affront to her. She was accustomed to getting what she wanted, and in this case, she couldn't have it. As the hours passed, the sun outside began to dip below the clouds, casting a warm golden glow across the cabin. The lights inside the plane dimmed, and most passengers settled into their seats, preparing for the long stretch of the flight ahead. Darnell had closed his eyes, perhaps in an attempt to rest, but his mind was far from calm. He couldn't forget the icy feeling of Meredith's cold gaze, the dismissive air she had when she spoke to the flight attendants, the way she had physically turned away from him as if his presence was too much to bear. It was moments like this when the subtle racism was almost imperceptible to everyone except those on the receiving end that made him question whether things would ever truly change. He could feel it in the way Meredith refused to acknowledge his humanity, her actions speaking louder than her words. She wasn't just uncomfortable with the situation, she was uncomfortable with him. It was a feeling that many people of color knew all too well, the constant battle to prove their worth, to show they belonged, to demand respect even in spaces where they had every right to be. But in this moment, Darnell wasn't focused on the fight. He was focused on his family, the warmth of their home, the laughter that awaited him when he landed. He was determined not to let Meredith's behavior ruin his day. He closed his eyes again, breathing deeply to center himself. He had made it this far in life by keeping his peace, by refusing to let ignorance dictate his actions. And he wasn't about to let it take away his joy now. Meanwhile, Meredith sat stiffly in her seat, her mind still churning with thoughts. She had tried to distract herself by flipping through the in-flight magazine, but it was no use. Every time she glanced up, her eyes found Darnell. The longer she sat there, the more agitated she became. It was as if something in her was slowly unraveling, and the more she resisted confronting it, the more she felt it clawing at her. She thought about her life, her privileged upbringing, her education, the comfort of her world. She had always believed that people like her were the ones who made the rules, the ones who had the power, the ones who dictated the social order. And yet, here she was, seated next to someone who seemed completely unaffected by her discomfort. It made her feel powerless. She had always prided herself on her ability to control situations, but this one felt out of her hands. The captain's voice suddenly filled the cabin, signaling that the plane had reached cruising altitude. The seatbelt signs turned off, and the flight attendants began their rounds with snacks and drinks. The soft rustle of trays and the low murmur of voices seemed to drown out the unspoken tension in the air. As the flight wore on, Meredith's discomfort grew. She had managed to avoid speaking to Darnell for most of the journey, but now, the silence between them felt unbearable. She shifted in her seat, crossing and uncrossing her legs, her gaze darting around the cabin as if seeking something to distract her. Her hand reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, but her eyes didn't focus on the screen. She couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she needed to do something, say something, anything to resolve this strange, unsettling experience. Darnell, on the other hand, had no such impulse. He had long accepted that some people would never understand him, would never accept him. He didn't owe Meredith an explanation or an apology for simply existing. Instead, he focused on the comforting thought of seeing his family soon. The memories of their last reunion filled with love, laughter, and warmth were enough to ease the tension in his shoulders. No matter what happened on this flight, he had a life to look forward to. As the hours stretched on, Meredith began to feel the weight of the situation. She had tried to ignore it, but the discomfort was now consuming her. It wasn't just about Darnell anymore, it was about something deeper. It was about a part of her own belief system being questioned, and that scared her. She had lived so long in her bubble, surrounded by people who reinforced her views, that now, confronted with someone who didn't fit into that narrative, she didn't know how to react. And just when she thought she could not stand the discomfort any longer, the plane suddenly jerked, sending a ripple of unease through the cabin. The seatbelt signs flickered back on, and the overhead bins rattled as the plane began to shake. For a brief moment, everyone froze, their attention drawn to the unexpected turbulence. The flight attendants rushed to secure the cabin, and Darnell instinctively gripped the armrest, his heart pounding slightly faster. Meredith, her face pale, grabbed the armrest with white-knuckled hands. For a moment, it felt like the entire plane was caught in a fragile balance, suspended between the sky and the earth. The turbulence grew stronger, shaking the plane more violently. Gasps filled the cabin, and the lights flickered as if the plane were battling against an invisible force. Some passengers murmured in fear, others clasped their hands together, eyes wide in uncertainty. Darnell's mind raced, but he remained calm, trying to center himself. Meredith, on the other hand, was visibly shaken. Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps as the plane bucked beneath her. The turbulence seemed to amplify her anxiety, the fear gnawing at her as she gripped the armrest harder. For the first time in the flight, she looked directly at Darnell. The fear in her eyes was raw, almost primal. And then, something unexpected happened. The plane lurched sharply to one side, and Meredith's head whipped to the side, colliding with the armrest. She gasped in pain, momentarily dazed. Darnell, quick to react, reached out instinctively to steady her. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice calm, a stark contrast to the panic in the air. Meredith's eyes were wide, her mouth slightly agape. She blinked, surprised by his concern, but before she could respond, another violent jolt rocked the plane. The lights flickered again, and a sudden sense of disorientation washed over everyone. Darnell's hand remained on Meredith's arm, steadying her, as the plane continued to shake and rumble. In the midst of the chaos, something shifted. The turbulence wasn't just about the flight anymore, it had become a metaphor for something larger, something deeper. The turbulence seemed to intensify, each violent shake of the plane pulling more gasps from the passengers. The lights flickered once more, casting the cabin in brief moments of shadow, only to be replaced by a harsh, sterile light that made the tension feel even more suffocating. Meredith's breath was coming in short, frantic bursts, and her knuckles were as white as the seatbelt buckle she gripped. Her heart was pounding in her chest, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and disbelief. This was no ordinary turbulence, it felt different, as if the plane itself was being tossed around by forces beyond anyone's control. Darnell's hand was still on her arm, steadying her, though he too was now fighting the rising anxiety in his own chest. He could feel the fear emanating from her, the way her body stiffened and jerked with every jolt. The thought of leaving her to cope alone never even crossed his mind, despite everything that had happened. His instincts kicked in. He had been in uncomfortable situations before, but in this moment, he was simply focused on helping someone in need, as any decent person would. "Hold on," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It's going to be okay. Just breathe." Meredith, her eyes wide with panic, couldn't speak. Her mouth opened and closed as if searching for the right words, but they didn't come. She nodded quickly, her gaze shifting from his face to the turbulent outside world, where the sky seemed to darken ominously, like an unseen storm was brewing just out of sight. Her body remained tense, rigid with fear, as if preparing for the worst. The plane lurched again, this time with a sharp, unsettling jolt that threw the entire cabin into chaos. Overhead compartments popped open, spilling items onto the aisle. A small cry escaped from a child several rows back, and the flight attendants rushed to assist where they could, but their calm voices barely cut through the rising panic. Meredith, unable to hold onto the armrest any longer, grabbed Darnell's arm tightly, her fingers digging into his skin. I can't," she whispered, her voice trembling with the terror she was trying to keep under control. Darnell didn't let go. He felt the fear in her grip, but he held firm, his mind racing as the plane continued its erratic movements. There was something in the air now, an unspoken urgency that everyone in the cabin seemed to feel but couldn't name. Passengers were exchanging anxious glances, some silently praying, others looking out of the windows as if searching for anything to give them assurance. But nothing came. The turbulence showed no sign of letting up. The plane shook violently, the force of the jolt slamming Darnell and Meredith into their seats, their bodies pressing into the armrests, their muscles straining against the pressure. Darnell's stomach twisted, but he remained calm, his thoughts sharp. He had flown countless times before, but this felt different. It felt like the world was turning against them, like the plane itself was fighting to stay in the sky. He glanced out the window, his heart pounding faster as he saw the blackening sky beyond. The clouds had thickened, swirling in a way that felt almost unnatural. They weren't just ordinary storm clouds, they were ominous, as if they were closing in on the plane, trapping it in a storm that no one could escape. The lights flickered again, this time lasting longer than before. The cabin seemed to be enveloped in a strange, suffocating stillness, broken only by the occasional gasp or cry from the other passengers. Meredith's grip on Darnell's arm had not loosened, and in the brief moments when their eyes met, she seemed almost desperate, as if looking for someone to ground her. Her face was pale, her lips trembling, and for the first time since she had boarded the plane, she didn't seem like the confident, controlling woman who had demanded a seat change just hours earlier. Now, she looked small, vulnerable, as though she were just another person, just another human being at the mercy of something far bigger than herself. Suddenly, there was another sharp jolt, even stronger than the previous ones, and the plane tilted at a terrifying angle. Screams rang out as the lights dimmed and then completely went out, plunging the entire cabin into darkness. For a moment, the only sound was the rush of air, the frantic breathing of the passengers, and the pounding of Darnell's heart in his chest. He could feel the sweat trickling down his back, his own body reacting to the fear that was now spreading like wildfire through the cabin. Meredith's grip tightened painfully, but Darnell didn't flinch. He had to stay strong, for both of them. He reached out with his other hand, holding hers firmly, trying to reassure her, though he could feel the tension coursing through her. He wasn't sure if he was trying to calm her or himself, but at that moment, he knew they were in this together, whether she liked it or not. The fear had stripped away the facades, and all that was left was a raw, unfiltered vulnerability that neither of them could escape. The darkness stretched on, an eternity in those moments when they were suspended in mid-air, caught between fear and uncertainty. It felt as though the plane was falling, but then, just as suddenly as the darkness had descended, the emergency lights flickered on, casting a harsh, red glow over the cabin. The sound of the engines was muffled, but not silent, and the uneasy tension of the passengers slowly began to ebb. But no one dared to speak. The air was thick with dread, and every passenger seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the next shift, the next change. And then it happened. A sudden, sharp crackling noise came through the overhead speakers, followed by the voice of the captain, strained but steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We are experiencing some unexpected turbulence, but we are doing everything we can to stabilize the plane. Please stay in your seats with your seat belts fastened." The words were meant to reassure, but they did little to calm the rising panic that was still swirling through the cabin. Darnell could feel it too. Something was wrong, something was off. The captain's voice didn't sound as confident as it should have. The trembling in the speakers suggested that even the crew was struggling to maintain control. The plane seemed to have lost its balance, as if it were battling against something much stronger than itself. Meredith's eyes were wide, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she clung to Darnell's arm, unable to tear her gaze from the emergency lights flashing around them. The intensity of the moment was suffocating, as if the entire flight was suspended in a fragile moment of time, waiting for the inevitable. But Darnell couldn't afford to look away. He had to stay alert, stay present. The flight attendants were trying to calm the other passengers, but their efforts seemed futile against the overwhelming sense of fear that had gripped the cabin. The shaking, though slightly less violent, still made the walls feel as though they were closing in. It was clear now. They were all in danger. The thought clung to Darnell's mind like a cold shadow. And just when it seemed as though the storm outside couldn't get worse, it did. The plane lurched again, this time with such force that the oxygen masks fell from the compartments above. Screams echoed from all around them as the oxygen masks dangled like ghosts, ready to be pulled. Darnell's heart raced as he snapped the mask onto his face, but Meredith froze, her wide, panicked eyes fixed on the mask dangling above her. She couldn't bring herself to pull it down. And then, the most chilling moment of all occurred, the plane tilted sharply to one side. The plane tilted even further, and for a moment, it felt as if time itself had stopped. Darnell's heart slammed in his chest as the angle of descent became more pronounced, and the air pressure in the cabin shifted violently. The oxygen mask swayed above, but Meredith's hand remained frozen at her side, her eyes wide with terror as if the simple act of pulling the mask down would make the reality of the situation too real. She stared at the mask, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but it was clear, she couldn't bring herself to act. Meredith! Darnell's voice was sharp, but the chaos of the moment drowned out any semblance of calm. He reached for the mask above her, grabbing it in his hands and gently pulling it down, trying to place it over her face, but she recoiled, almost pushing him away. Her eyes were filled with fear, a fear so raw that it was paralyzing her, keeping her from doing what was necessary. "Please, just breathe," Darnell urged, his voice steady despite the panic crawling at the back of his mind. His hands were shaking now too, but he had to stay focused. He pulled the mask to her face again, this time more insistent. "We're going to get through this, but you need to breathe." But Meredith wasn't listening. She pulled back even further, clutching her chest as if she couldn't breathe at all. Her face had gone an even paler shade, her eyes flickering between him and the uncontrollable chaos outside the window. Darnell's hand hovered over her arm, unsure of what to do. He had never seen someone so paralyzed by fear. He had faced fear himself many times, but not like this, not when it was so powerful that it completely took away someone's ability to function. The thought of leaving her, of walking away from her in a moment like this, wasn't even a consideration. Despite everything that had happened, despite the way she had treated him, this was no longer about them. This was about survival. And then, just when he thought the situation couldn't get any worse, the emergency lights flickered and the plane made another violent lurch. The entire cabin tilted sideways, and with it, a loud, gut-wrenching screeching sound came from somewhere deep within the plane. It wasn't the normal sound of turbulence, it was something worse. Something mechanical. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, followed by a muffled thud. The sound was almost drowned out by the panicked shouts of the passengers, but Darnell caught it, his heart skipping a beat. The airplane wasn't just shaking anymore, it was damaged. Something had gone wrong beyond the turbulence, beyond the storm. The plane was in trouble, and it wasn't just the weather anymore. This was something mechanical, something far worse than they could have imagined. "Stay calm, stay calm," a flight attendant shouted from the front of the cabin, but her voice was shaky, and there was a note of panic that couldn't be masked. She was trying to maintain control, but even her tone betrayed the fear creeping into her mind. The overhead compartments shook as if threatening to come loose, and Darnell could see passengers scrambling for their masks and their seatbelts, the chaos escalating beyond anything he had ever experienced. Meredith, still gasping for air, looked up in horror, her eyes catching the flight attendant's frantic movements. It seemed to break through her paralysis, and for the first time, she reached up, snatching the oxygen mask with trembling hands. But even with the mask over her face, her body remained tense, her chest heaving in shallow breaths. The fear was still consuming her. Darnell's eyes darted around the cabin, taking in the panic that had taken hold of everyone. The elderly couple across the aisle, once so calm, was now gripping each other's hands in silent terror. The group of teenagers, who had been laughing earlier, were now wide-eyed and whispering prayers, their youthful optimism crumbling under the weight of the moment. Even the flight attendants, those pillars of authority, were visibly shaken, their usual calmness stripped away by the uncertainty of what was happening. And yet, despite the chaos unfolding around him, Darnell couldn't shake the feeling that something else was at play here, something deeper, something more sinister than just a mechanical failure or turbulence. He had seen people react to fear before. He had seen the worst of human nature come out in moments like this. But there was something off about this situation. It wasn't just the mechanical noises, the angle of descent, or the storm outside. It was the sense that someone was making this worse. Darnell's mind raced as he tried to make sense of it. What was happening to the plane? Why was the turbulence so erratic? Why had the plane's systems suddenly failed? The answers were elusive, but one thing was becoming clearer by the second: something had deliberately gone wrong. Then, as if on cue, another sharp lurch tore through the plane, followed by a sudden drop that sent several passengers into a panic, screaming as the entire aircraft seemed to plummet for a few harrowing moments. The oxygen masks, though in place, did little to ease the growing sense of dread that now filled the cabin. Every second felt like an eternity, and no one could ignore the feeling that they were teetering on the edge of something much worse than a simple emergency. As the plane leveled off, the captain's voice came through the intercom again, though this time, it was more strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing extreme turbulence. Please remain calm and follow the instructions of the crew. We are doing everything we can to stabilize the aircraft." The flight attendants moved quickly through the cabin, offering what little comfort they could, though their hurried steps were anything but reassuring. Their actions spoke louder than their words, and it was clear no one had expected this. Darnell looked toward Meredith, who was now sitting rigidly in her seat, her hands trembling. She had pulled the mask off her face, her eyes wide and frantic as she tried to regain control of her breath, but the fear still gripped her tightly. In that moment, Darnell's heart softened toward her. He couldn't blame her for being terrified. In a world where everything was meant to be predictable, to be controlled, the sheer randomness of what was happening now was enough to crack anyone's composure. But that didn't mean they had the luxury of falling apart. "Meredith," Darnell said, his voice low but firm. "Focus. Just focus on breathing. This is just turbulence, okay? We'll make it through this." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for some sort of answer, some sign of reassurance. But Darnell could only offer her what he had left: his steady presence, his calm in the storm. He wasn't sure if his words were enough, but he wasn't about to leave her to face it alone. The tension in the cabin was suffocating now. The stakes had changed. This wasn't just a matter of surviving the flight anymore. It was about getting through a moment where everything seemed to be breaking down, and no one knew how far the descent would go. But even as Darnell held Meredith's gaze, something else caught his attention. A figure moving through the cabin, quick and purposeful, weaving between seats. It wasn't a flight attendant, and it wasn't a passenger. It was someone else entirely. And they were heading straight for the cockpit. Darnell's heart skipped a beat as he watched the figure make its way down the aisle, moving with such intent and speed that it was impossible to ignore. The person was dressed in dark clothing, blending in with the shadows that the emergency lighting cast across the cabin. At first, Darnell thought it might be another crew member, trying to maintain some semblance of order in the chaos. But then he noticed something that made his stomach drop: a set of unfamiliar, worn boots tapping quickly on the floor. The figure was headed straight for the cockpit, and that couldn't be a good sign. Panic surged through Darnell as he instinctively stood, his mind racing with possibilities. He didn't know what was happening, he didn't even know if it was the right thing to do, but he had to act. No one else seemed to have noticed, or at least, no one was reacting fast enough. The cabin was still full of chaos, passengers clutching their oxygen masks, others whispering frantic prayers, and the flight attendants doing their best to calm the storm of panic in the aisles. Meredith, still struggling to regain control of her breathing, barely noticed Darnell getting to his feet. Her eyes were unfocused, her face pale and drawn, but her body had begun to relax slightly, her chest rising and falling with more regularity. She was getting there, but the terror still clung to her. It was clear that this flight had broken something inside her, but it wasn't over. Not yet. Darnell moved quickly, weaving through the passengers with a sense of urgency that made his heart race. He didn't know who the figure was or what they wanted, but there was no time to waste. Every second counted. As he neared the cockpit door, he saw the figure's hand reach for the control panel, just inches from the door's handle. The person was almost there. Darnell's pulse quickened, a rush of adrenaline flooding his body as his instincts screamed at him to stop them before it was too late. His mind flashed through every scenario, none of them good, and he acted on impulse, pushing past a row of seats and grabbing the arm of the mysterious figure. "Stop!" Darnell shouted, his voice loud enough to cut through the chaos in the cabin. The figure spun around, their face hidden by the hood of a jacket. But Darnell could see the glint of panic in their eyes, the same look he had seen on so many of the other passengers. This wasn't someone who was calm or in control, this was someone desperate, someone who had already lost whatever sense of composure they had left. "What are you doing?" Darnell demanded, his grip tightening on the person's arm. The figure's mouth opened, but for a moment, no sound came out. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, they said, I didn't mean to. I thought." Before they could finish their sentence, a sharp noise filled the air, an agonizing, screeching sound that made the hairs on the back of Darnell's neck stand up. The plane lurched once more, violently tilting to one side. The force of the shift sent passengers flying against the seatbelt restraints, screams echoing as the aircraft seemed to drop out of the sky. The emergency lights blinked erratically, throwing everything into further disarray. Darnell was thrown off balance by the force, but his grip never wavered. He kept a tight hold on the stranger, pulling them back from the cockpit door. But the person wasn't fighting him, not at first. Their bodies seemed to go limp, and Darnell could feel the tension in their muscles give way to something that resembled defeat. This wasn't someone who had been planning an attack. No, it was something else. Fear, desperation, and confusion flooded from the figure like an unspoken truth. The door to the cockpit opened, and 2 flight attendants rushed out, their faces pale with terror. They weren't running from the cockpit, they were running toward it. And then, just as quickly, they stopped in their tracks when they saw Darnell standing there, holding the mysterious figure by the arm. Who are you?" one of the flight attendants asked, her voice trembling with the weight of their shared fear. Darnell didn't have the answers. He didn't know who the figure was or why they were heading for the cockpit, but he knew they were in the middle of something far bigger than themselves. The panic that had gripped the cabin hadn't come from the turbulence alone. Something else was happening, something that no one was prepared for. The uncertainty had infected everyone in the cabin, and Darnell realized with a sinking feeling that this might not have been a random act of panic after all. The figure finally spoke again, their voice shaky, almost broken. "I didn't mean to. I thought I could. I thought I was supposed to stop it." The flight attendants exchanged confused glances, and Darnell's confusion deepened. "Stop what?" he asked, his grip tightening. "What are you talking about?" The figure's eyes flickered with fear as they glanced at the cockpit. "The plane. The malfunction. The system's been tampered with. The storm, it's all part of it. It wasn't supposed to go like this, but I was trying to stop it from crashing." The words hit Darnell like a punch to the gut. His mind raced to connect the dots: turbulence that felt unnatural, the mechanical failure that seemed to strike without warning, and the strange behavior of the mysterious person. It wasn't just random chaos, it was planned. Someone had intentionally sabotaged the flight, but for what purpose? And who was behind it? Before Darnell could react, the plane lurched again, more violently than before. The cabin was filled with screams, but this time, there was something else: a deep, ominous sound coming from the cockpit. A low hum, followed by a sudden, terrifying silence. The plane had dipped too low. The engine sputtered and faltered, and for a moment, the entire plane seemed to hold its breath. And then, just as the panic reached its peak, something unexpected happened. The lights flickered, but this time they remained on. The plane steadied, the shaking halting just long enough to give the passengers a moment of hope. A loud click echoed through the cabin, and Darnell felt the air around him shift. The cabin seemed to return to a semblance of normality, as if the chaos had never happened. The system was stabilizing. Darnell let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his muscles relaxing slightly. He turned to look at the mysterious figure, still standing frozen in his grip. The fear had not completely left their face, but there was a glimmer of relief mixed with guilt. "It's over?" Darnell asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure nodded, their eyes filled with regret. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I was trying to stop it, but I didn't realize how bad it had gotten. The storm, the system malfunction, it's all connected. They were trying to. I had to stop them. I had no choice." The realization hit Darnell like a cold wave. He wasn't just a passenger in this chaos, he had been part of something far bigger. The storm outside, the sabotage inside, and the figures pulling the strings were all part of a conspiracy that had nearly cost them everything. But before Darnell could process it all, the final twist came just as the plane began its descent toward safety. A voice crackled over the intercom, clear and calm, as if nothing had happened. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now approaching our destination. Thank you for your patience and understanding. We apologize for the inconvenience caused during the flight." The truth? They had almost crashed. And no one would ever know the full story. The final shock rippled through Darnell's mind as he sat back in his seat. The plane might have been saved, but the mysteries surrounding it had only just begun. And as the passengers began to settle back into their seats, their fear replaced by tentative relief, Darnell knew one thing for sure: nothing would ever be the same again. The plane finally touched down with a thud that made the passengers' collective breath leave their chests in unison. The moment of relief was almost suffocating, as if the pressure that had been building for hours had suddenly been released all at once. The emergency lights were still flickering faintly, the hum of the engines quieting as the aircraft rolled to a stop on the tarmac. A sharp contrast to the frantic chaos that had taken place just moments before. The cabin, once filled with an uneasy tension, now buzzed with a mix of disbelief and cautious relief. People slowly unbuckled their seatbelts, glancing around, unsure of what to do next. There was no announcement yet from the flight attendants, no clear indication of how to proceed. It felt as though the entire flight had been a blur, a nightmare that none of them were quite ready to wake up from. Darnell sat back in his seat, his hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline. He had been through a lot in his life, but nothing had ever quite shaken him like this. The turbulent flight, the mechanical failure, the mysterious figure with their cryptic warnings, it all felt like a story that could never be fully explained. But there was one thing that stood out above all else: survival. They had made it, and that alone was a victory. As the plane came to a complete stop, the seatbelt sign turned off, and the murmurs of relief grew louder. Passengers began to gather their belongings, some still looking around nervously, unsure if the danger had truly passed. Others were already on their phones, calling loved ones to reassure them. The sense of shock was palpable, but Darnell could see the change in the atmosphere. People were beginning to realize that they were alive, that they had made it through the unimaginable. Meredith, who had been quietly breathing through the ordeal, finally removed the oxygen mask from her face, her eyes blinking against the dim lights. She looked at Darnell, her expression softening in a way that seemed to acknowledge something unsaid. For the first time since the chaos began, she seemed human again, no longer trapped in a world of fear and disbelief. She gave him a small nod, a silent thank you, and Darnell couldn't help but feel a flicker of empathy for her. The woman who had once turned her nose up at him, the one who had judged him without a second thought, was now just another person who had survived the unimaginable. He offered her a small, reassuring smile, though he wasn't sure if she saw it. The connection between them was fleeting but significant, one of shared trauma, of being thrust together in a life and death situation where class, race, and previous judgments meant nothing in the face of survival. As passengers began to disembark, Darnell lingered in his seat, his thoughts a swirling mess. He needed answers. He needed to know what had really happened, who had been behind the sabotage, and why the storm had felt so carefully orchestrated. But for now, all he could do was sit in the aftermath, his mind running over the events of the flight like a loop. He hadn't had a chance to speak to the mysterious figure who had tried to get to the cockpit, but he knew that person held the key to understanding the whole situation. The flight attendants were ushering the passengers off the plane, but Darnell stood up and made his way toward the back of the cabin. The atmosphere was still tense, but the flight crew was working efficiently, their professional demeanor slowly returning as the reality of their survival set in. They were doing their best to manage the chaos, but even they seemed shaken. It was clear that no one would be leaving the airport without answers. He reached the galley, where one of the flight attendants was speaking in hushed tones with a security officer. The attendant's face was pale, her body language stiff, but she turned to Darnell as he approached. "Mr. Darnell, right?" she asked, her voice still shaky but polite. "Yeah," Darnell replied, trying to keep his own nerves in check. "I need to speak to the authorities about what happened on that flight." She nodded, glancing over her shoulder as if to make sure the coast was clear. "We'll be getting off soon, and security will want to speak to everyone." "But it's not over yet. There's more to this." Darnell's stomach churned at her words. "What do you mean? What happened?" What was that? He gestured vaguely, unable to find the right words to describe the disaster he had just lived through. The attendant hesitated, her eyes darting nervously. "I don't know exactly, but the plane was tampered with intentionally. It wasn't just the weather, the storm. Someone hacked into the system. The storm was part of it." "The malfunction? Planned." Darnell's mind raced. "But why? Who would do that?" She shook her head. "I don't know. But they're going to get to the bottom of it. The authorities are going to investigate, but it'll take time. It's bigger than us." A wave of dread washed over him. The plane had almost crashed. It had been sabotaged by someone who had known exactly how to make everything fall apart. But now, for the moment, they were safe. They were on solid ground, with security steps being taken to ensure everyone's safety. "I just need to know who did this," Darnell murmured. The attendant looked at him, her face still pale. "You might not get the answers you're looking for, but we'll have to see how it all unfolds. Be careful. You're not the only one who knows something about what happened." Darnell was about to ask her more when a voice came over the intercom again, this time calm and official. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Please proceed to the gates in an orderly manner. Our team will be assisting you with further information. Please remain calm. Your safety is our top priority." He turned and walked back to the main cabin, his mind a whirlwind of questions. Who had done this? Why? And most importantly, what would happen now? But no matter how many questions he had, the reality was that answers would not come immediately. He was in the dark just as much as everyone else. As Darnell stepped off the plane and into the terminal, he felt a strange sense of detachment, as if the last few hours had been some twisted dream. The airport was buzzing with activity, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air. Security was heightened, and everyone seemed to be moving with purpose. In the crowd, he could see officers, their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights, taking statements from passengers and crew alike. Darnell's thoughts were interrupted when he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned, half expecting to see another official or a security officer, but it was Meredith. She had followed him off the plane, her eyes still wide with apprehension. She didn't look scared anymore, but she still seemed unsettled, her movements stiff, her gaze darting around as if she was unsure of her place in the world now. "Darnell," she said, her voice quieter than before. I don't know what to say. I was so wrong, and I..." "Don't," Darnell interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. "We've all been through a lot. It's not about being right or wrong anymore. It's about surviving. You made it through. We made it through." She nodded, her face softening for a moment. "Thank you. For everything. I don't know what would have happened if you weren't there." Darnell looked at her, the woman who had once judged him, and now seemed to be looking at him in a way that held respect. "I didn't do it for thanks," he said quietly. "I did it because we were all in it together. No one gets out of something like that alone." Meredith nodded again, her eyes thoughtful. They exchanged one last look before she turned, walking off toward the exit, disappearing into the crowd. Darnell stood there for a moment longer, watching her go, before he turned to face the line of security personnel. The question still lingered, the mystery of the flight and the sabotage unsolved, but one thing was clear: survival had connected them all in a way that no amount of fear or judgment could break. They had made it out, and that was all that mattered for now. And as Darnell stepped into the future, uncertain of what would come next, he knew this was a story that would stay with him forever, a story of survival, of human connection, and of the unexpected twists that could change everything in an instant.